Hi everybody, I'm Christina, thanks for the introduction. I just want to share maybe an experience you might also have had. Like 6 months ago I handed in this abstract and then I stood myself and I thought, oh, I handed in quite an abstract, oh, in English. So I will be a bit challenged with the English, so excuse if I might sometimes read from the papers because we will actually go through quite a complex topic. But yeah, I hope it's working out. So, as Joran said, I'm from the Center for Internet and Human Rights, but I do want to pay credits to the work I did for the last 4 years, together with my colleagues from the Amadeo Antonio Foundation. They have a stand here also. A lot of these things on counterspeech are actually developed in a discussion with them and working with them, and meanwhile the topic occurred. There is a lot of ideas from them in here. So in the Center for Internet and Human Rights, just to let you know, I do research now concerning youth and the use of memes in online culture and the way youth use these forms of messages maybe to express political attitudes. But today I will maybe as counterspeech, so that's why we also speak about counterspeech. So maybe an explanation why it is too long didn't read. Because when hate speech and toxic online behavior became part of online culture, or it always was, but there was attention that this is bad for society, especially in online society, and that came especially with the rise of right-wing populists, gaining a lot of attention, and then later also political power. The strategies of these movements are globally mainly the same, and they do tend to use social media to grab attention, attack political enemies, and pillory and create atmosphere of behaviors that hate speech and harmful speech is conducted in a rapid way. Counterspeech appeared then as a measure against this form of hate speech, so it's a deeply political idea, and I will speak today about it really more as a political question that we still need to deal with today. So counterspeech was the idea of the democratic-orientated person to speak up in social media and condemn these behaviors. And when Heiko Maas in 2017 made the fight against hate speech in social media one of his political priority as a Minister of Justice he was then, the pressure went to the platforms, social media platforms. And the discussion became very strong towards a state regulatory practice as the solution to deal with hate speech. And looking back, I can see how alternatives are still overlooked, because I feel political state regulators, in analyzing the problem hate speech, just read the first line and fell for a typical too long didn't read. So that's why I will speak about counterspeech as a concept. As a whole, we will go a bit into depth. Then I will talk about the Network Enforcement Act, maybe you know it as Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, NetzDG, and the governmental program against hate and hounding. And thirdly, I will close with a short outlook. So here we are. What is actually counterspeech? And counterspeech is any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. It can be crowdsourced, like initiatives like Ich bin hier, I am here, do it, or it can be individual. Maybe it's very important to say that it's always reactionary and too harmful message, and then that always implies a hierarchy. Like, we should never think of hate speech, counter-speech in equal ways. There is a hierarchy and there is a power structure in those ones who attack and who do these harmful messages, in those two response. And that is very important always to consider. Now we will start and we will go back into the history of counterspeech in the conceptual grounds. You see here Justice Louis Brandeis. He did have an idea about counterspeech. He was a judge And many platforms, I want to also say, that come from America have this deep understanding of freedom of speech formed into their context of social, it is formed into concepts of social media platforms, as well as, for example, their Puritan idea of nudity, exposures of women's breasts. So the concept of how to deal with hate speech in free speech-orientated context goes back to this law case that Judge Louis Brandeis wrote as one of the greatest defense of free speech in American history, and it became the leading standard case. In this court case in the 20s, it was upholding the conviction of Charlotte Whitney, who had engaged in speech that raised a threat to society. And that was the establishment of the Communist Labor Party in America, who taught the violent overthrow of governments. Even though she herself denied that this was her intention to become an instrument of violence, Brandeis wrote a concurrence, and a concurrence is like a speech that a piece that a judge can add as an opinion to a court's decision. And in this, he underlines unpopular ideas should have an opportunity to be competed in the marketplace of ideas. So he states in this paper, if there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies to avert the evil by a process of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech and not enforced silence. So here he grounded, in this case, this idea of the marketplace of idea, and that free speech should be in this marketplace of idea, should be the measure of all. So that is, and also even with those ones who might be threatful to society. So 1927, the internet and social media are far away, but he grounded a concept of a democratic process and free speech who were deeply intertwined for him. Counterspeech was for him the speech made in opposition to other speech. But the concept of counterspeech also comes with context. So to speak up is one of the most important matters of counterspeech. And here's an example that will lead us from American concept of Brandeis to the question of speaking up in German history. Because what happens if no one speaks up in the marketplace of ideas? And if silence and violence is enforced? And what if anti-democratics start to dominate the marketplace of ideas and take over the competition? Here we have a statement attributed to Pastor Niemöller, and he describes the experience of silencing as well as of the democracy turning towards dictatorship, and the dictatorship is the end of the marketplace. That is always, the market is gone. So here it's written, first they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. This quote I like very much because it shows that not only the German experience of bystanding, but also emphasize something very important about counterspeech itself, the structure. Because counterspeech is not only for those ones to speak up for themselves, but it has a deep concept of protection and solidarity for others, to speak up for others. Counterspeech is not only for those who are affected and attacked, harassed and publicly threatened, it is also for those ones who witness and bystand to take part. So German laws and discussion around free speech and regulation hold a deep historic experience, and that's why their free speech in Germany is regulated, for example, such as the Holocaust denial. That is a classic of this regulation of speech. What I want to come to is to speak about what we call dangerous speech. So hate speech, it's a threat. There is also a law to it now, but actually it's a discriminatory, it has parts of discrimination, and the question is more, what is actually dangerous speech? Dangerous speech can be hate speech, and there you see a graphic from the Dangerous Speech Project. That is a project run by Susan Banach that I worked for quite a few years. And the thesis here is to say, okay, there's certain speech that is not hate speech, but it inspires violence. So suppressing certain speech can also become this dangerous speech. It can inspire violence, but it cannot be held accountable as hate speech, and that is really a problem. So interestingly, I give you now here an example of discipling detour communication. For example, if we look at Holocaust denial, if certain right-wing extremists cannot speak about it, they will use detour or deciphering detour communication. And the online world has a very specific form of it. I show it to you here. It's called dog whistling. And dog whistling is a specific message that only particular group are able to understand. And here I give you the example. You can see there a little spot says, "Don't worry, we broadcast at a frequency that only white people can understand," and behind him are very racist comments. That is kind of the idea of dog whistling, and down there you can see the idea of dog whistling, even though Pepe the Frog has become the picture of the alt-right, the right-wing extremist troll groups, mainly also from America. We can see here very clearly Trump shared this meme in order to dog whistle, to say, okay, I'm here with you. And the same, of course, don't forget, we have very similar dog whistling techniques also in the German scene. So, but the question, going back to counterspeech, is how to apply counterspeech to these kind of phenomena. And what do you do with those ones who are very clear about their intention, but not clear about their words? And what kind of counterspeech is applied to these forms of encrypted messaging? So counterspeech wisely would aim at those ones, and you see down there the silent audience. A classic of those ones who work with social media, you know, there's a huge amount of people who consume content, who read and inform. Maybe if you work with youth and kids, ask in your class, in your groups, okay, who's actually producing content and who's only consuming, and you probably feel this, it's like a 80-21 sort of rule. So a lot of them consume, certain people curate, and very few do produce own content. And that's a dynamic that is difficult if you want to speak about counterspeech, because the consuming of dangerous and hate speech is probably very high. On top of it comes the question, if you say, okay, we want counterspeech as part of an online debating culture, that most passive consumer of information and messages sit in a disinhibition effect, that they don't speak out. And furthermore, then we have chilling effects and so-called self-censorships. If the climate is toxic, that will make other users kind of not speak out and not counter speech. Okay. I want to speak to you about which online user actually haven't encountered hate speech. And here's a data analysis of 2016, and the latest one is 2019. And that's also a question I give for those ones who work with youth or in education, is ask for the experience. And if you ask in these groups, you will probably find, I can tell you from my experience, that at least 80%, if they are honest and they say, yeah, we have experienced hate speech or kind of strange commentary, maybe also disinformation or things that we were thought right. And the numbers here of Forza show us 85% of 14 to 24-year-olds have already been confronted with the fact, and others with dubious media. So it is a common shared experience, and that's actually interesting to work on these common shared experiences to apply and to speak about counterspeech and why it is so important. The problem with counterspeech is detecting hate speech, but the problem I told you is also dangerous speech. And with everything and all the numbers I will present you here, you will find it's quite dangerous to detect it. So the context is always important. So it's very hard to measure the impact of counterspeech. And those numbers we have, and there's really very few research, there's a lot of research about hate speech now it's begun, but the research on counterspeech is very problematic, because in the end we always come to the point, or many studies come to the point that yeah, but the context is relevant. Biographical context is relevant. For example, in this study that looked at in civil commentary. Another part that is also very important is the stuff that stuff that's coming now. The technical developer, AI filter, sentiment analysis. They can only be a part of detecting in social media what is hate speech and dangerous speech. But it always needs human to detect these contexts, so that we cannot solve this whole problem with technical filters. Part of it, yes, but it always needs to be connected in kind of an onion layer idea. And then there's also nudging and studies about nudging. There's no outcome yet, but it's interesting to question if automated messages that create positive influence online are like online behavior. That is kind of the future of studies on counterspeech. So, counterspeech and disinformation, I just shortly give you the key points, because disinformation and hate speech are intertwined. Debunking rates, so-called debunking, that is kind of explaining the information, putting it into a context, saying what is manipulated about disinformation, usually reach a proportion of like 10 reach the fake news or the disinformation, and one part of it can only see the debunking or the explanation. So that means, as a consequence, it is very important to have people who do debunking, nevertheless, but in the question, who do we reach and how do we get counter information going, you need a very high intervention level. Otherwise, the disinformation will just stay with the consumer. And the intervention to debunk needs to be right in the moment while attention is alert. And that means for pedagogues, for those ones who work in education, exactly that same moment to speak about maybe disinformation that has gone through, to go right into the conversation. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to dissolve. Quickly, I want to speak what is counterspeech for platforms, because platforms love counterspeech. Here we see Sheryl Sandberg. Of course, it's great for Facebook and for other platforms to say counterspeech is a great concept, because what does counterspeech mean? It means I don't need to change anything. I just have people who create content, that's great stuff for me, that create data, and they do counterspeech, but it means they don't need to speak about rules, about community standards, about applying communities in their processes. They don't need to explain algorithm. It's not bad to support it, but it's a question also what to do with it, and I see here really double standards. Okay, so for me the key to counter speech is the community, or to work with community, and I will come now to the point where I think in the whole debate we overlook actually the users or those people who are affected. So community-based rules. Facebook standards are not, community standards are not community rules. They're made by a policy team. They have never been made by people who are part of the community. And I think that's very important. And even you can involve community in the process of deletion, account blogging, and content moderation as a part of them. Often there's users who are highly identified with platforms and they volunteer to be part of it. And if you would be a clever platform, you would support that. And you would engage people in being part of the platform. But the downside or the cost, and I think that's worth a big cost, is that you need professional support. You need community manager, you need digital social workers, you need to communicate between them and always be part of a process. So between big platforms and communities, there's often no exchange, and that is actually something that if we want to think it more democratic and create atmosphere that people want to be there, and counter-speech is also happening, that needs to be built on. I'm coming now to the so-called Network Enforcement Act. The structure of this law is a fine proceeding. So that means if you don't apply certain laws that they have created, so that you have to take down certain hate speech within 24 hours, you will have to pay fine. So that idea, actually, you find also in Germany, if companies don't want to employ people with certain disabilities, sometimes they rather pay the fine or the fine proceeding than making the effort of integrating someone maybe with disabilities. So this whole thought of this enforcement, it even says, of this law is to treat people with penalty. But the question is actually how can we instead reward those who do well and those who are interested in really solving the problem. The NetzDG functions in a very deep logic of threat, and nevertheless, the law is really questionable and under the viewpoint of users. So I ask myself always, who knows actually this law and who understands what it is for? So because you can flag or detect content under community standards, but also under Network Enforcement Act, you need to find it. All sorts of different procedures are there. Every platform does it different. Is it really for those who are affected from hate speech? I would say no, that is really a politician between platform law, but it's actually not for those ones who are affected because they are totally overloaded with trying to flag. And does it really help in promoting counterspeech? Don't think so. It's really to push the platforms into doing something, but it's not for actually counterspeech and user protection. So here you have the law regulates this relation, but does the outcome of those who are really in need of help, who've been doxxed, who have been harassed, it's very hard to do something with this law with them. It only affects the big platform that promotes the idea. And it is basically, that's the main critics, privatization of law enforcement. And what I think, it really doesn't solve the problem, especially not of dangerous speech. There is another interesting thing that I just want to say about counterspeech, because there's a federal program that was established in 2017, strengthening civic engagement on the web projects against online hate speech, and that was funded by the Federal Ministry of Family Affairs for 2 years. It's part of a strategy to prevent extremism and promote democracy. It's called Democracy Live. It's around 2.5 million that were put in there, and 33 projects did actually do counterspeech or develop all kinds of ideas how to enhance people to fight hate speech online. And this ends 2019, and there is no extension of this line. Yeah, the ministry has kind of decided digital stuff we need to do, but maybe everybody should do a little bit. And that's another problem that I think that here we have a learning and we have projects who actually try to apply counterspeech and to find out knowledge, but it just runs out. Okay, my last 2 points, and then I'm finished. I think everybody needs to do something, and this goes actually to the Steinmeier, who said yesterday here, who said platforms need to be taken into more responsibilities. I also think politics need to really taken more into doing something, and as I showed you, the program is running out, the NetzDG doesn't really solve the problem, all done by the party of Steinmeier himself. And I think it's quite hypocrite to only, I'm not a platform fan, just want to say, I have a lot of critics against the big platforms, but to only let them solve the problem, it's not going to work. So I think that there needs to be a non-profit social framework for it, and there really needs to be politicians acting on it and not only putting the responsibilities on others. Every user living the consequence of now and every moment for poor actions of these politics, as well as the platforms, I don't want to take them out, about hate speech and counterspeech right now. And they need to take care, enhance, reward good counterspeech and healthy communication, and enhance also the community. Communities should participate more in nudging, in filters, in AI, in community standards. You need to make people who use the platform also be part of the platform and be part of the self-design. I think that is something very important. So, just want to say thank you very much. We have a research paper, some of these research I showed you on the internet of the dynamics of hate speech and counterspeech. And I skipped a few pages, but I will be happy to be in the corner speaker and discuss with you more solutions and ideas how this could happen. It's okay? Ich weiß jetzt nicht, wie die Zeit ist.
We could take one more question from the audience here, and then we would shift the discussion on K4, which is the level down there. Could you come to the stage to bring up your question?
I'm Björn from LoveStorm, one of these projects. We offer training and infrastructure for these communities to organize themselves of counterspeech. And you said you were speaking about digital social worker. I've never met one. Can you give me some?
I am one.
But are there more examples of, like what is this? I mean,
okay. Actually, it was part of my work at the Amadeo Antonio Foundation was to be a digital street worker and to work with youth who affiliate with right-wing extremist idea, to encounter them online and to kind of see the digital space as the street. Yeah, so social media was my street, and I worked with them, and I debunked information, and I did relation building through social media in order to think about why you affiliate so high with right-wing extremism. And just to say, there is more digital social worker. I know about 10. They all work in different fields. Some work with refugees, some work with migrant communities, and all they do is use social media in order to inform, advise, or also sometimes debunk and counter speech.
Thanks again, Christina Dinar.
Yeah.